Napoleon could no longer repress his dissatisfaction. Meeting General Guyot on the road, he reproached him in the presence of the troops for having so ill-guarded his artillery. He was no less violent towards General de Gionne, and he ordered that he should be tried by council of war. He sent the Duc de Belluno permission to retire from the service and gave the command of his corps to General Gerard, whose courage and activity had surmounted many difficulties during the campaign. In short, Napoleon acted with a degree of severity at which he was himself astonished, but which he conceived to be necessary in the imperious circumstances of the moment. General Serbier, the commander-in-chief of the artillery, after allowing the first moment of anger to pass away, ventured to call to mind the many important services of General de Gionne. Napoleon listened to these representations and then tore the order which he had dictated for the general's trial by a council of war. The Duc de Belluno, with deep mortification, received the emperor's permission to quit the army. He repaired to Sevilla, and with powerful emotion appealed against this decision. Napoleon gave free vent to his indignation and overwhelmed the unfortunate marshal with expressions of his displeasure. He reproached him for reluctance in the discharge of his duties, for withdrawing from the imperial headquarters, and for even manifesting a certain degree of opposition, which was calculated to produce mischievous effects in the camp. The conduct of the Duchess de Belluno was also the subject of complaint. She was lady of the palace, and yet had withdrawn herself from the empress, who indeed seemed to be quite forsaken by the new court. The Duke in vain attempted to defend himself. Napoleon afforded him no opportunity of reply. At length, however, he gained a hearing. He made a protestation of his fidelity and reminded Napoleon that he was one of his old comrades and could not quit the army without dishonor. The recollections of Italy were not invoked in vain. The conversation took a milder turn. Napoleon now merely suggested to the Duke that he stood in need of a little respite from the exertions of a military life, that his ill health and numerous wounds now probably rendered him unable to encounter the fatigues of the advanced guard and the privations of the bivouac, and too frequently induced his quartering officers to halt wherever a bed could be procured. But all Napoleon's endeavors to prevail on the marshal to retire were ineffectual. He insisted on remaining with the army, and he appeared to feel the emperor's reproaches the more severely in proportion as they became the more gentle. He attempted to justify his tardy advance on the preceding day, but tears interrupted his utterance. If he had committed a military fault, he had duly paid for it by the fatal wound which his unfortunate son-in-law had received. On hearing the name of General Chateau, Napoleon was deeply affected. He inquired whether there was any hope of saving his life, and sympathized sincerely in the grief of the marshal. The Duc de Belluno, resuming confidence, again protested that he would never quit the army. "I can shoulder a musket," said he. "I have not forgotten the business of a soldier. Victor will range himself in the ranks of the guard." These last words completely subdued Napoleon. "Well, Victor," said he, stretching forth his hand to him, "remain with me. I cannot restore to you the command of your corps because I have appointed General Gerard to succeed you, but I give you the command of 2 divisions of the guard. Now let everything be forgotten between us." The scene here described has at various times been the subject of misrepresentation, but it was thus Napoleon expressed his displeasure, and thus he was appeased. The bulletin dated from Montereau bears the impress of the sentiments with which Napoleon was affected at the time it was written. Mention is made of the faults committed by Generals Leretier and Montbrun. The passage relative to the mortal wound of General Chateau is particularly remarkable after what has just been mentioned. It is as follows. General Chateau will die, but he will die regretted by the whole army. To a soldier, such a death is preferable to an existence purchased by surviving his reputation or by stifling the sentiments which French honor must inspire in the circumstances in which we are placed. Napoleon slept on the 18th at the castle of Sevilla, where he also passed the following day, when the magistrates of the neighboring districts assembled at the headquarters. During the engagement, many of these individuals had taken refuge in the woods. Among the number was distinguished Monsieur Soufflot de Mercy, who described in forcible terms the pillage that had been committed by the Prince of Württemberg's troops. Napoleon soon found himself surrounded by as many tricolored scarves as epaulettes. A deputation from Provence admitted the number of faithful functionaries who eagerly afforded succor of every kind to the army and furnished Napoleon with important information relative to the enemy's flight. On the 19th, Napoleon dispatched orders on all the different roads, directed that the enemy's columns should be incessantly harassed in their retreat, and that our troops should, by a general movement, pursue him on Troyes. General Gerard marched forward in pursuit of the Austrian column that had escaped from Fontainebleau and was now retreating by the road to Sens. The Imperial Guard drove between the Seine and the Yonne, the wrecks of the enemy's corps who had defended Montereau. The Duc de Taranto and Reggio advanced on Bray and Nogent and cleared the right bank of the Seine. Napoleon conceived that this was the favorable moment for bringing into operation the army of Lyons, by the help of which he hoped to conclude the campaign. It might cut off the enemy's retreat and render our last successes decisive. On this force, therefore, Napoleon rested his hopes. The levies in mass of Dauphiné had already been augmented by those of Savoy, and under the command of Generals Marchand, Desaix, and Seurat, had reestablished the important communication of Mont-Cenis. General Bubna had evacuated Montiel and the neighborhood of Lyon. The banks of the Saône were cleared, and the Austrians, compelled to act on the defensive, were concentrating their forces on Geneva. After such advantages gained by levies in mass, what might not be expected from the troops of the line? Napoleon ordered the Duc de Castiglione to march up the banks of the Saône to drive off all the enemy's detachments that might yet remain there, and then, penetrating into the Vosges, establish himself in the rear of the Allied forces. He was directed to assail all the enemy's convoys, baggage, and detached parties, to produce a general rising of the peasantry, and finally to alarm the Allies by threatening their line of operations and their intended course of retreat. But this army of Lyon, which was to be composed chiefly of troops brought from Italy and Catalonia, could not be rendered so numerous as Napoleon had at first calculated. This important plan was deranged by the circumstances which then arose in Italy. The King of Naples had just raised the mask. Though connected with Napoleon by the ties of blood and indebted to him for all his greatness, he turned against him. And at what time? When Napoleon was unfortunate, these were the concluding words of a proclamation of Prince Eugene, and they were re-echoed throughout Europe. The young viceroy, surrounded by enemies, manifested a degree of energy equal to the circumstances in which he was placed. He opposed the Austrians on the Mincio and the Neapolitans on the Taro, but he could not send to Lyon the promised supplies of troops, which it was expected would give a decided superiority to Marshal Augereau's army. This was misfortune, but energy may sometimes supply the place of numbers. Marshal Augereau had already at his disposal 2 well-disciplined divisions, which had arrived from Catalonia, commanded by Generals Musnier and Pelletier. It was hoped that the Duc de Castiglione, inspired by the importance of the part he was called upon to act, would display his former intrepidity and perform some exploit worthy of his heroic character. Napoleon neglected no means of rousing the energy of his old comrade. He instructed the Empress herself to see the young Duchess de Castiglione and to prevail on her to contribute her efforts to save the country by exerting all the influence which she was known to possess over the heart of her husband. During the 24 hours that Napoleon remained at the castle of Seville, every precaution was adopted for satisfying the public mind in Paris, where the report of the cannonade at Montereau had excited alarm. Messengers were dispatched with the first accounts of our success. These were succeeded by a bulletin. This bulletin was speedily followed by Monsieur de Montmar, one of the principal orderlies of the army, who was appointed to present to the Empress the standards taken at Nangy and Montereau. On the 20th, Napoleon, with the main body of his forces, proceeded along the left bank of the Seine by the road of Montereau to Nogent. He breakfasted at Bray, in the house which the Emperor of Russia had quitted on the preceding day. And on the evening of the 20th, he entered Nogent with the Duc de Reggio's corps, which arrived by the road of Provins. Nogent had suffered dreadfully. General Bourmont and the brave troops under his command had, during the 10th, 11th, and 12th, resisted the army of Prince Schwarzenberg in its attempt to cross the Seine, and had yielded only at the last extremity. The town therefore presented nothing but ruins, burnt houses, walls mutilated by loopholes or perforated by cannonballs, and here and there a few inhabitants who had nothing but their lives to lose. Amidst these disasters, the Sisters of La Charité of Nogent had continued in their hospital to succor the wounded. The resolute devotedness of these good sisters had procured for them the esteem and respect of generous enemies, and of this our wounded experienced the advantage. Napoleon ordered the sisters and the curate of Nogent to be introduced to him. He thanked them in the name of the country, and presented them with 100 Napoleons from his private treasury.